Professor Nam Yong Lee's long commentary. Is it still free country if even KakaoTalk is monitored? Hello, this is Nam Yong Lee on Lee Nam Yong Professor TV. Today I would like to think together with you about a question that touches the everyday lives of countless citizens. How far should the state be allowed to look into KakaoTalk, the app you use every day? On the surface, it may sound like a simple story about a chat application, but in reality, I believe it is the most sensitive link in the system war of the Republic of Korea, lying at the crossroads between liberal democracy and digital dictatorship. KakaoTalk is not just a chat app, it has become national infrastructure. First, we must clearly recognize that KakaoTalk is no longer a mere tool for private chatter. Citizens use KakaoTalk not only to talk with family, friends and colleagues at work, but also for financial authentication, public services, taxi hailing, shopping and even political discussions. KakaoTalk has already gone beyond being a private communication network connecting person to person and has become de facto national infrastructure connecting citizens and companies and citizens and government. If KakaoTalk stops or loses public trust, it is not just a few chat windows that disappear. The entire web of relationships that holds our society together begins to shake at once. Second, from the perspective of relational philosophy, KakaoTalk is not an object in the form of a single app, but a huge hub in which countless relationships are intertwined. Conversations between individuals, civil petitions to administrative agencies, transactions between consumers and businesses, communication between politicians and supporters, all take place on the same platform. Therefore, who designs, who controls, and who monitors this platform can completely change the level of freedom in Korea and the structure of checks and balances on power. How we treat KakaoTalk is in the end directly connected to the question of how we design the system of the Republic of Korea itself. Third, from the perspective of the US federal government enterprise architecture, that is the US federal government's FEA, communication and information services are not classified as mere IT technology elements, but as public services directly tied to the government's core business areas. Through reference models for performance, business services, data and technology, FEA provides a common language for systematically managing security and privacy across the federal government, and it includes separate security and privacy profiles within it. Such advanced architectures force governments, when designing digital infrastructure, to consider not only national security and public services, but also citizens' rights and privacy at the same time. We too must handle KakaoTalk and similar messengers within this level of national architecture. Otherwise, we may become a strange country whose technology is at an advanced level, while its freedom and human rights remain at a backward level. Why do free countries not lightly peer into private conversations? In a liberal democracy, power between the individual and the state must be in balance. The global standard is to guarantee each and every citizen freedom of expression and privacy, and to design state power so that it intervenes only minimally and strictly according to law. The United Nations and major international organizations, through various resolutions on the right to privacy in the digital age, have emphasized that the rights people enjoy offline must be equally protected online, and that communications surveillance must be grounded in law, strictly necessary and proportionate, and subject to independent oversight. If we look at the constitutional spirit and human rights standards of advanced countries, they are extremely wary of state domination over the realm of private conversation. This is because when a system collapses, the first things that always fall are freedom of speech and the safety of private communication. A healthy democracy can only be maintained when people are able to share their thoughts without having to read the room and without fear. Even when advanced liberal democracies judge that wiretapping is necessary for criminal investigations and national security, they require very strict procedures. These include the warrant requirement, oversight by an independent court, limits on the duration and scope of surveillance, and the principle that information unrelated to the target must be discarded. Instead of allowing government agencies to demand unlimited data from messenger service providers, they only permit access in a minimal way when the requirements of legality, necessity, and proportionality, in line with international human rights standards, are met. This is the true form of digital communications governance in a free country. Conversely, in countries where speech is not free, private conversations in effect come under a public surveillance network. Citizens no longer trust one another and feel that at any moment their conversations could end up in the hands of those in power and be used as grounds for punishment. As a result, people gradually begin to censor themselves and choose safe words instead of honest opinions. Outwardly, it may look quiet and calm, but in reality, a structure is formed in which the system presses down on the mouths and hearts of the people. We must see the issue of KakaoTalk monitoring not as a simple technical matter, but as a question that tests the very foundations of the liberal democratic system. How do digital dictatorships take control of messengers? Digital dictatorships tend to follow a similar pattern. At first, they strengthen regulations over messengers and social media under plausible pretexts that are hard to oppose, such as national security, preventing terrorism, blocking fake news and protecting youth. In the next stage, they pressure platform operators to locate their servers domestically, to hand over encryption keys, or to embed automatic censorship functions for specific keywords and figures into their systems. Once this happens, citizens' private conversations begin to be trapped inside an invisible data surveillance net. International reports assessing global internet freedom show that in many of the countries surveyed, internet freedom has been deteriorating year after year, and some analyses say that only about 1/3 of the world's population lives in a truly free internet environment. The remaining majority live in partially free or unfree countries where they are exposed to censorship and surveillance. These statistics show that digital dictatorship is no longer a story from the movies, but a reality that is already unfolding around the globe. The next step is usually targeted surveillance aimed at political opponents, civil society organizations, and journalists. Rather than trying to monitor the entire population at once, digital dictatorships quietly track and analyze the voices they consider dangerous. Through messenger data, they identify who talks to whom, how often, which groups they belong to, and which protests or opinion-forming activities they are involved in. Whenever necessary, they use this information as a means of intimidation, pressure, and hostage-taking. International statistics also show that the proportion of countries where people are arrested or threatened for their online expression is very high, and this reality confirms the picture just drawn. In the language of relational philosophy, digital dictatorship is a phenomenon in which power penetrates directly into the web of relationships between citizens. The proper role of the state is to respect the autonomous relationships between citizens and to intervene only minimally when disputes arise. Digital dictatorship does the exact opposite. Power monitors and intervenes in citizens' everyday networks of relationships in real time through messengers, social media, and search engines. This is not a simple technical issue, but a dangerous transformation in which the very nature of the political system itself is altered. Where does Korea's KakaoTalk surveillance debate stand by international standards? In the Republic of Korea, debates over the surveillance and censorship of messengers like KakaoTalk have repeatedly resurfaced. Whenever a particular incident occurs, the National Assembly and the government argue that for investigative convenience they must expand the submission of messenger data, or that, for national security, messengers must be more strongly controlled. Civil society and experts, on the other hand, warn that this will seriously infringe on the freedom of private conversation, and that the voices disliked by those in power will be the first to quietly disappear. The problem is that this debate often devolves into emotional and factional conflict, while serious discussion about what principles and architecture should be put in place fails to take place. If we look at international comparative indicators, Korea's position is by no means one in which we can feel at ease. In several global assessments of internet freedom, Korea ranks high in terms of technology infrastructure and penetration rate, but is sometimes classified as a country with certain restrictions in terms of freedom of expression and the proportionality of regulation. In OECD evaluations of digital government, Korea is also described as a frontrunner in technology and infrastructure, yet still having a gap with advanced best practices in data governance, transparency, and citizen participation. This goes beyond the simple issue of reputation in international organizations and is a warning signal about where our system is headed. It is easy for citizens to think, I am not a criminal, so it has nothing to do with me. Will my life really change just because someone looks at my KakaoTalk? But international statistics show that sanctions for online expression have already become routine worldwide. What may seem like someone else's problem today can become the reality our children's generation faces tomorrow. The indifference and fatigue of the public ultimately become the most powerful fuel for the abuse of power. From the perspective of relational philosophy, who is controlling whom in KakaoTalk surveillance? Relational philosophy views the world not as objects but as relationships. The issue surrounding KakaoTalk is not simply one of whether to monitor a single app or not, but a relational question of who controls whom and in what way. Messenger surveillance is essentially an act of resetting the balance of power between citizen and state, business and state, and citizen and business. If the state is allowed to look into messengers at will, citizens will no longer trust companies, and companies will find themselves in an awkward position between the state and their users. As a result, the social capital of trust that holds our society together is eroded. The US federal government enterprise architecture addresses such issues structurally through the performance reference model, business reference model, service component reference model, data reference model, and technical reference model, along with dedicated security and privacy profiles. These profiles require the government as a whole to analyze what personal data each information system handles, what risks exist, and what control mechanisms must be put in place. The key point is that they first design safeguards to prevent misuse of information, rather than seeking easier ways to collect it. This is the direction of global governance. When we discuss messenger surveillance, we too must start not from the standpoint of investigative convenience, but from such an architectural perspective. Relational philosophy poses yet another important question. In the current design, who benefits the most, and what consequences does it have for the weakest? When KakaoTalk surveillance is strengthened, those with political power, rich legal knowledge, or resources to hire top lawyers can always defend themselves better. In contrast, socially weaker individuals, those who do not understand the law or the system well, or people who simply exchanged a few words of complaint in their daily lives, are exposed to far greater risks. Various global studies show that a majority of internet users live in environments where they could be placed in danger because of their online expression. In the end, the burden of messenger surveillance tends to fall most heavily on the most vulnerable citizens. This is why relational philosophy regards KakaoTalk monitoring not as a mere technical issue but as a problem of structural inequality. Global standards demand open digital government and trustworthy algorithms. The OECD's Digital Government Policy Framework and AI principles emphasize that even as digital government evolves into a data-driven and platform-based government, it must not lose openness, citizen centricity, and trust. In particular, the open by default principle states that government should, as far as possible, make not only data, but also its policy-making processes and algorithms transparent. This means that citizens must be able to know under what standards and procedures the government requests messenger data, what risk assessments were made, and what controls have been implemented. The global standard for digital government calls not for more surveillance, but for greater transparency and accountability. The OECD's AI principles also stress that the use of artificial intelligence and data must respect human rights and democratic values, and that systems must operate in an explainable and accountable manner. The same standards should apply to messenger surveillance. It is not enough to say the algorithm will take care of it or the government needs it. If there is censorship or monitoring of KakaoTalk, the legal grounds, criteria, responsible bodies and remedies must be disclosed in language that citizens can understand. This is the trustworthy digital governance that the international community demands. When the World Bank, IMF and OECD evaluate digital government and e-government, they now look not only at the level of digitization, but also at transparency, citizen participation, and the protection of human rights. If Korea is to become a truly advanced digital leader, it must meet these global standards across all digital infrastructure, including KakaoTalk. What is the minimum line of digital freedom we must defend? Now we must ask ourselves, is it still a free country if even KakaoTalk is monitored? This is not merely a complaint, but a question about where we draw the minimum line of freedom we must defend. I believe that line is the principle that we do not allow unlimited surveillance that is not subject to warrants and judicial oversight. No justification can legitimize a permanent backdoor that allows the state to look into citizens' private conversations at all times, even when there are reasons such as national security and crime prevention. Such powers must always be narrowed to the minimum and subjected to strict scrutiny. This is the common direction of international human rights standards and digital governance best practices presented by the United Nations and the OECD. The solutions are clear. First, we must establish clear legal standards and procedures for messenger surveillance. Rather than relying on ambiguous administrative guidelines or practices, we must spell out in laws and institutions, in language the public can understand, what is allowed and what is an absolute red line. Second, we must strengthen independent oversight bodies for wiretapping and digital surveillance. Parliament and citizens should participate in continuously monitoring and checking abuses by power-holding agencies. Third, platform companies such as KakaoTalk must actively adopt their own norms and technical safeguards to protect users' rights. End-to-end encryption, minimization of logs and regular transparency reports are no longer optional but essential. Fourth, like the US federal government enterprise architecture, we too must build national-level digital architectures that incorporate security, privacy, and citizens' freedom as core elements from the very beginning. If we become an ignorant, incompetent, and greedy citizenry, those in power will at any time use our indifference to gradually strip away our freedoms. But an awakened citizenry that understands how relationships are designed and sees through the essence of this system, war will not be easily deceived. The KakaoTalk surveillance issue is not a battle between political camps. It is a question of what kind of country our children and grandchildren will live in. If we turn away from this problem today, the next generation may have to live in a far narrower digital prison. Now is the time to look not at objects, but at relationships, to read international statistics and global standards correctly, and to join together in defending the minimum line of digital freedom. Thank you for watching Professor Nam Yong Lee's long commentary.